Ever feel like, I don't know, the ground's about to shift under your feet? That's what today's deep dive feels like for me, really. We're tackling the Israel-Hezbollah conflict, and believe me, this one's tailored just for you. See, skimming those headlines, it's easy to get stuck on explosions and statements, but there's so much more beneath the surface.
It's like trying to understand an iceberg by only looking at the tip.
Right, exactly. And that's why you're here, thankfully, to help us unpack this whole thing. Give us the why behind the what.
I'm here for it. The listener wants clarity. And to get there, we've got to dig into the historical context for sure. But by the way, topnaturalhealth.com, where this article came from, they actually have a promo code just for our listeners. All the details are in their site. But back to the point, the article kicks off with these recent missile strikes. Deadliest in like 2 decades. It feels huge, but also almost expected. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, because these flare-ups in the region, we hear about them so often. But you're right, it's like we're missing pieces of the puzzle when we only focus on what's happening right now. This isn't some sudden eruption. It's more like pressure building under the surface, for decades.
Okay, so let's release some pressure, shall we? The article talks about Hezbollah starting out as a resistance movement back in the 80s. What were they resisting exactly? And how did they go from that to, well, this? It all goes back to Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon. Hezbollah came out of that resistance, backed by Iran right from the beginning. But here's where it gets really interesting. They didn't just fade away when Israel withdrew. They became a major political player in Lebanon, winning seats in parliament, running social programs, all while still having their own independent militia.
Hold on. So they're a political party, A&D, a military force that's almost unheard of, and the article kept using the phrase proxy for Iran. Honestly, that always trips me up a little. Can you break that down for our listener? Why is Iran, a country hundreds of miles away, so invested in this particular fight?
Okay, so picture this. Iran sees itself as a major power in the Middle East, right? Big ambitions. But there's this obstacle to their goals, Israel. And that's where Hezbollah comes in. Think of it like a chess game. Hezbollah's a powerful piece that Iran can use strategically, exerting pressure, weakening their rivals, expanding their influence in the region. They can make a move on the board without being directly involved in every single clash.
So it's not just about the land itself. It's about this way bigger power struggle happening across the Middle East. Suddenly, all those headlines about Iran's nuclear program start to make a lot more sense.
You got it. It all ties together. For Israel, Iran's nuclear ambitions, not some abstract threat. It's an existential one. Knowing they could be targeted with very little warning, that changes everything about how they act and react.
This is why I love these deep dives. We start with what seems like a regional conflict, and boom, we're talking international relations and nuclear threats.
Overwhelming? Maybe. But definitely eye-opening.
And we're just getting started. This latest escalation, just one chapter in a much longer story. To really get it, we need to rewind a bit back to 2006.
Ah, yes, the 2006 Lebanon War. The article kept bringing it up as a major turning point. Why was that conflict so significant? What were its lasting effects?
2006, that was Hezbollah's way of showing everyone they were a serious military force. Their rocket arsenal especially, they inflicted some real damage within Israel. It completely changed the game. It wasn't about controlling territory anymore. It was about the ability to strike deep inside each other's borders, inflict damage, instill fear.
So it was like Hezbollah's announcement. We're here to stay. We're not afraid of a fight. Exactly. It shifted the power dynamic in the region, really. All of a sudden, Israel had to take the threat from Hezbollah very, very seriously. The stakes just got a whole lot higher for everyone involved.
And knowing all this history, these recent events, it's even more alarming. What's different this time around? What makes this escalation so noteworthy, even compared to everything else that's happened?
2 big things, really. One, Hezbollah's capabilities. They've grown massively since 2006. This isn't some ragtag militia anymore. Their arsenal is bigger, more advanced, and their experience fighting in Syria. That's giving them some serious combat experience. They're a far more credible threat to Israel than they were back then.
And the second thing?
You can't forget about what's happening inside Lebanon.
Right. The article mentioned the economic crisis over there. It's really bad. That can't be helping matters.
Not at all. Lebanon is incredibly fragile right now. You got the aftermath of the Beirut port explosion, a total economic meltdown, political instability. It's a tinderbox, honestly. And this internal fragility makes everything much more unpredictable, more dangerous. Any mistake, any miscalculation could be catastrophic for everyone.
Wow, so you've got this incredibly tense situation on the border, and a whole country on the verge of collapse internally. It's easy to get caught up in the military strategy of it all, but at the end of the day, it's the people caught in the middle of this that I keep thinking about.
And that's exactly where we need to shift our focus.
It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitics, right? The
Mm-hmm.
strategies, the power plays. But at the end of the day, it's the people actually living through this. That's what gets to me.
It's easy to forget sometimes, listening to the news from thousands of miles away. There are real people living with this every single day. The fear, the uncertainty.
It's heartbreaking, and I think the article did a good job capturing that. Those quotes from people in both Israel and Lebanon, it really personalizes the whole thing in a way that headlines just can't.
That weariness, it's like this fatigue with conflict. It's woven into the fabric of their lives. You have Israelis who've grown up with the threat of rocket attacks always there. They can tell you the exact moment their lives were turned upside down.
And then on the other side, you have families in Lebanon just trying to rebuild their communities, mourning their loved ones, terrified for their kids. It's a never-ending cycle of pain.
It really is.
I can't even imagine trying to go about my day with that hanging over my head. And we haven't even touched on the economic side of things. The article mentioned Lebanon's economy is already in a terrible place. What would a full-blown war do?
It wouldn't be good. War is devastating to an economy, even a contained one. More damage to infrastructure, businesses destroyed, supply chains disrupted. Honestly, it'd be a humanitarian crisis waiting to happen, making it even harder to provide basic necessities: food, water, medicine.
It's hard to imagine things getting much worse than they are now.
And that's the terrifying part. It really is like staring into the abyss.
Which brings us to the question everyone's asking. Is there any hope for a ceasefire? What does a path forward even look like at this point?
It's messy, there's no doubt about that. I'm cautiously optimistic about a ceasefire, at least in the short term. The article mentioned those diplomatic efforts by the U.S. and France. They carry weight, and it seems like everyone understands that all-out war would be a disaster. However...
There's always a however.
Right. A ceasefire is just a Band-Aid. It might stop the bleeding temporarily, but it doesn't address the underlying infection. For a lasting solution, we need to deal with the root causes we keep talking about. Iran's influence, Hezbollah's power in Lebanon, the lack of trust.
It's like they say, peace isn't just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice. We can't just cross our fingers and hope things calm down. Something fundamental has to change.
Exactly. And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What happens next? How do we even begin to predict the long-term trajectory of something this complex?
Well, you tell me, you're the expert.
Predicting the future is a fool's errand, especially in the Middle East. But we can look at potential scenarios, right? Try to game out the possibilities. One possibility is a return to the status quo. A fragile ceasefire here and there, punctuated by periodic flare-ups, the tension never really going away. But that's not sustainable, is it?
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone.
Yeah.
What other scenarios are we looking at?
The one that keeps a lot of analysts up at night is this escalation spiraling out of control, either through miscalculation or a deliberate choice. That can draw in other regional players, turning a localized conflict into a much larger regional war.
Okay, so not exactly uplifting possibilities there.
No, not at all. But understanding these potential outcomes, even the bad ones, it's crucial. But there is another scenario, one that's less about predicting the future and more about shaping it.
Now that is something I'm interested in hearing about. What would that look like?
Imagine a more proactive approach to diplomacy, where the regional powers, Iran included, they come together not just to react to crises, but to actively address the root causes of this conflict. What if they negotiated a security framework that worked for everyone, where dialogue replaced violence?
That sounds incredibly idealistic, almost impossible given the history.
Of course it would be incredibly difficult. But difficult isn't impossible, right? It would take a fundamental shift in thinking, a willingness to move beyond old grievances and look for common ground. It demands bold leadership willing to challenge the way things have always been done, a commitment to dialogue over violence, and perhaps most importantly, a collective refusal to accept that this cycle of conflict is inevitable.
Like you said, difficult doesn't mean impossible. But it really makes you think, what can we, regular people who aren't diplomats actually DO with all this information? It's easy to feel helpless when you're up against something this massive.
You're right. It can feel overwhelming. But even just being aware is a powerful tool, honestly. You've already taken that first step, choosing to learn more about this conflict, to go beyond the headlines. That's where change starts.
So it's not enough to just know the facts. We have to let that knowledge actually affect how we talk about these things, our own views, even our choices.
Exactly. We can have real conversations with people around us, friends, family. We can demand better from our leaders, urge them to prioritize diplomacy, finding peaceful solutions, even just staying informed, not letting these stories fade away. Those are small acts, but they matter.
Because if we forget about the people living through this, haven't we already failed them in a way?
You got it. Behind every headline, every statistic, there are real people whose lives are changed forever by this conflict. Their stories matter, and their resilience. That should inspire us to act.
You know, for me, the most powerful part of this whole conversation has been connecting the dots, seeing how those individual experiences are tied to these huge geopolitical forces. It's easy to get lost in the weeds, but it's those human stories that remind us what's really on the line.
It's all connected.
And that's what we do here on the Deep Dive, right?
Yeah.
Take these complex issues, these seemingly impossible situations, break them down, unpack them, and hopefully help you connect with the human side of it all.
That's the goal.
We covered a lot today. The history of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict, the regional power dynamics at play, the very real human cost, and even maybe a glimmer of hope for a more peaceful future. It's a lot to process.
It really is.
And we didn't even have time to get into all the potential international involvement, how other global powers might be viewing this, what their interests are, how they might be acting behind the scenes. It's something to keep in mind. There are always more layers to uncover.
Always more to learn.
So, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep asking the tough questions. Keep seeking out different viewpoints. Keep diving deeper into the issues that matter. Remember, staying informed isn't just about knowing what's happening. It's about using that knowledge to build a better world, a more informed world, a more engaged world, a more peaceful world. And don't forget to check out topnaturalhealth.com. They've got some incredible resources to support you, and let's face it, we could all use a little support after a deep dive like this one. They've got a promo code just for our listeners too, just a little thank you from us for being so curious, so engaged. Until next time, stay curious.